it was my pleasure to introduce Colin Green. Colin is indeed one of the leading labor economists. And not only that, he is editor-in-chief of Education Economics and also associate editor of JBO, I think.
Correct,
so
yeah.
Just a word of warning, if you ever want to publish a paper in one of those two or both journals, then don't ask any hard questions and be nice to Colin. Other than that, I think, Colin, you're okay with taking any questions during the seminar. So if anybody wants to ask a question, please unmute the microphone, but if not, then keep the microphones muted while Colin is talking. And as usual, the seminar is being recorded and will be on GLO website later this week, well, tomorrow or by Monday at the most. With that, over to you, Colin.
Cheers, thanks, Matlub. Thank you everyone for coming. Thanks for the invite. It's been a little while since I've done digital talk, so it might take me a moment to get the swing of it. Yeah, by all means, please ask me questions because I find these digital talks are a bit strange otherwise. So this is, I mean, it has a grand title, but I think it's a quite straightforward paper. It's a peer effects paper. It's a spillovers paper. It's going to be in Norway, so be prepared. And I'll kind of take you through what we're doing. We've been working on this for a while, but obviously comments appreciated. So I'm here in Trondheim at NTNU, the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. It's joint work with Christina Becker-Hein Holland, who was a previous master student here, and Jon Marius Vag Iversen, who is here with me at NTNU. So I'll try and talk you through why we got to doing what we're doing. So I think we're going to convince this audience, immigration changes society, including school environments. So this is going to be a paper about spillovers in schools. There's a massive literature on immigrant peers. I would argue that the bulk of this is about a fairly narrow thing, which is kind of core skill effects and some other educational outcome effects. So broadly, educational outcome effects of being exposed to immigrants in the school, right? So I've got some papers here, and this is just a selection, including John and my paper recently, that looks at whether being exposed to, in some cases, immigrants broadly, in our paper and some of these recent ones, refugee children, whether this affects the core skills of natives. And really the focus of that literature is there a negative effect or not? And the answer is it depends. So in Norway, we find negative effects kind of, I would say typically, so Dave Figlio's work with co-authors and other people in the US find zero effects. So this is an interesting, important question because it's really about whether, peers which might have some educational difficulties in some ways spill over and generate problems for other kids, and then there are clear policy implications about what you might do about this. Now, what I'd argue is, of course, is immigrant peers change school environments in a lot of broader ways. And, for instance, they are diverse peers. They're not simply peers which differ maybe in language skills, which I'll come to in a second, or other educational skills, but they have a whole range of kind of characteristics, both, you might think of readily observable and unobservable, which are likely to spill over in some way or may affect what we'll call, I'm not always happy with this terminology, native students is what a term I'll use, and then will be Norwegian students later. Now, of course, this is largely empirical literature I'm talking about before. A lot of these spillover effects are likely diffuse, so likely very hard to measure. But they're likely to have also important implications for, the way that schooling systems operate. And if we think about the original motivations or some of the original motivations for public schooling, they're around social cohesion, social capital, bringing people together from diverse backgrounds. But what I'd argue is that, this narrow focus might miss some wider effects of immigrant spillovers, which are typically hard to pin down. So one of the advantages of early literature is that there is a lot of work done, and we kind of understand what empirical approaches we can use to try and identify these basically peer effects. But these type of issues, generally affects the diversity, hard to measure, hard to identify. What we really focus on here is one particular part, and which I would also argue is typically very hard to identify, credibly. And what I'm going to try and convince you is that the Norwegian system and the Norwegian setting gives us some opportunity to get at this. So one way which, to come from this broad idea of just diverse peers, one way in which immigrants are different is they likely to have often different language skills, language backgrounds to native students. And again, being exposed to people with different language backgrounds may have an effect on you or not. This might be hard to measure. It's unclear whether it's important or not, or something we need to focus on. But one kind of subset you can think of is exposure to mother tongue speakers, native speakers in languages which are actually an active part of the education system in a given country, right? So for instance, Spanish in the US, French is always focused, French and German in the UK, and here in the Nordic countries, English is typically taught as a second language from a very early age. I'll talk a bit more about this in a second, and it's an active focus of policy to improve English language skills of children through to adults. Now we know that, a large literature showing that, not so much in economics, that mother tongue speakers are useful, right? Helpful inputs in learning languages. So, I think this is well understood, even if I can't point you to a lot of great causal estimates. But if we're going to try and pick this up, so this is what this paper is about, exposure of Norwegian kids to English-speaking immigrants, children. I would say that, in these type of cases here, French in the UK, Spanish in the US, these are important issues, interesting to look at, but it's hard to kind of think about how you'd empirically identify these effects, because whilst there might be a focus, for instance, I'm more familiar with the UK setting where I used to teach, there's a focus on French, there's a focus sometimes on German and Spanish, but there's selection into language classes. So people get to choose often which language class they go into. There's not universal testing. So even if we could get around this selection problem, we don't have metrics which are comparable on the attainment of school kids. And there's a pile of other problems like this which make it hard to identify these effects. So the advantage in Norway, this is to give you the research question, to finally get to the point. The question we're trying to hit is, does the exposure to English-speaking peers affect language proficiency in English of Norwegian students? We'll look at spillover effects in other domains, but the kind of spoiler is that there is no effect across other domains. So why is Norway interesting here? So what happens in Norway is that all children study and are tested in English from an early age, right? From basically the point of entry of school, they teach English, and then there is formal testing, universal testing, which occurs at a number of points along, right? So that's the first thing. It's not the language of everyday use, though. So, and this is something, I would at least tell you I know to be true, but is maybe harder to convince you of. And maybe if you've had exposure to being in Denmark or Sweden more than Norway, you may have a view that Norwegians have a universally brilliant English and that English is widely spoken. English is not the language of everyday use. There's a lot of variation in adults' use of English and ability to use English, even if everyone, I would say, under 65 can speak English. For instance, there's TV in English, but children's shows and any shows which are considered up to for about 12-year-olds are dubbed into Norwegian. Movies are dubbed into Norwegian, and the general rule I would use walking around is that if I talk to a young child, someone who I think is 10, 11, 12, I would probably try Norwegian first, not English, right? So it's not the language of everyday use. And for instance, it's not the language of everyday use in the workplace either, English. People speak Norwegian. Now, the other part which makes Norway useful, so we have this kind of emphasis, but a variation, emphasis in English, but variation in actual skills. We've had a large increase in recent immigration. So Norway, I'll show in a second, historically has had very little immigration. And obviously, if you go back long enough, it's a net immigrant country, right? So we had large increases in immigration, including English-speaking immigrants. There are barriers to teachers' entry. So there's a number of features of the education system, which again, I'll talk about, which make it a good setting. So we can't readily bring in teachers here. You have to be, all teachers have to be accredited. It's hard to bring in foreign teachers. There are very few native English-speaking teachers. So typically English is taught by a Norwegian generalist teacher, and there's no specialist teaching in primary school. And actually we have registered data as well. So that's going to be important for us. We're going to have complete coverage of cohorts of kids coming through. So hopefully you'll believe me that Norway is interesting, and you'll believe the kind of stories behind this as we go through. So to give you a giveaway of what we find, it says the spillovers paper, exposure to English speaking background students increases native students' English test scores, is what we find. So for instance, to give you an idea, they're not huge effects, but they're precisely estimated effects that attending a school grade with 2 or more ESB students increases kind of average English test scores at approximately 0.02 of a standard deviation. So that's the overall effect. And as I'll try and argue through, it's like an intention to treat effect, because we don't really observe peers as such, we observe school grades. As I go through, I'll try and show you more concentrated effects. For instance, that these operate entirely within gender pairs, right? Boys on boys, girls on girls, and they're larger, and only on Norwegian kids who themselves have above average English proficiency, right? So don't magically generate English scores, English ability, but our interpretation is communication, which is largely occurring outside of the classroom in the school environment between English speakers and kids who already have, Norwegian kids who already have some skill in the area, generates improvements, which fits in with what we kind of think about how people learn languages.
Sorry, Colin, could I just clarification? When you say English speaking background, do you mean these people have only, these are only those who have the first language is English, or
yes,
anybody who? Okay,
no, So I'll talk about it in a moment. This is the one thing we don't directly measure in the register. We don't know if people are English speaking backgrounds. So we're going to use a variety of different ways to try and proxy as someone being an immigrant for whom English is likely to be their first language. So I'll do that in 2 ways. So a really rough and ready way is just to use country of origin, which, coming back to the discussion you were having before the talk, isn't perfect, because of course, a lot of people coming from countries where English isn't the main language, but when they come into Norway, they are likely to be English speakers. And then we're also going to use some test-based measures where we basically take kids who are immigrants, they're either born abroad themselves or born to immigrant parents, and who perform above certain thresholds in English in earlier tests. And we use that as a proxy that they're likely to be English-speaking background kids. And the results aren't going to be affected by this. Let me get through some data and institutional details, and you should ask questions here. So some things I feel increasingly they're obvious to me, but they're kind of, there's a million things I could tell you about Norway, but that's not the purpose of this talk. So a few kind of little bits that I think are useful to know. So as I said, Norway historically has low immigration shares, much lower than some of the other Nordic countries, maybe not Finland, but definitely them, say Sweden and Denmark. So for instance, as a snapshot in 1989, about 4% of Norwegians could be said to have an immigrant background. And in practice, a large share of those were Swedish or Danish, right? So they were immigrants, but not kind of culturally very different. And to give you some numbers, entrant numbers in 1993, about 2,400, and by 2011, it was about 27,000. So, these things are always a bit contingent on how you measure them, but the kind of baseline number that Statistics Norway gives says about 50% of the population now has an immigrant background. And what they mean by that is they themselves were born abroad, or they're born to parents who were born abroad. So it's a very, very rapid change. This is, you know, like all Nordic countries, placements of refugees are highly regulated. Other immigrants are free to locate. So we're going to have to fuss about a lot of the immigrants that we're focusing on are non-refugees. So we're going to have to fuss about selection a bit. So some kind of figures here. I'm not sure how important, but you see these kind of upturns. 4 different groups. Your refugees here who have, you know, as we know, have waves to do with external events. We have an underlying level of people who, this is their point of first entry as well, so education. So some people who come in on education may stay in work. We've got work, which fluctuates a lot. There's a regional dimension to this, so some of this can be attached to fluctuations in the oil industry, for instance, but there's other causes here. And then we've got a family group, which are a bit hard to, my screen has just died on me. Give me 2 seconds. Let me just go to plan B. Have we got it back now?
Yes.
Good, sorry about that. So family are a little bit harder to say something overall because, you know, it's we can tie them. So in other papers, some of these entries are people who are attached to focal entrants who were refugees and sometimes to work related. So there's some mix in there. A few other kind of snippets. What do you need to know? Schooling in Norway, compulsory 6 to 16, but in fact, most, like 90% of children stay on after 16. Primary school is 1 to 7, middle school is 8 to 10, and that's kind of the bit you need to know about. That's what we're going to focus on. There's almost no private schooling, particularly in primary school, so it's very uncommon. Kids essentially, without exception, go to their local school. In fact, it's to the point where it's very, very difficult to change school without changing house. And there's very, very high rates of home ownership in Norway, such that, and people are quite immobile. There's no grade retention. Ability stream, not only is there no ability streaming, actually up to 16, it's illegal to do it in any way, with 1 or 2 minor exceptions. So people with, for instance, children with special education needs are taught in main classes, but with some added assistance, unless there's, you know, kind of, they have severe needs. School delays are rare as well. So kids start when the year that they're meant to, in some sense, and then there's no grade retention after. So there's completely kind of social progression. We're going to focus primarily, so our focal estimating group is the population of year 8 students across these periods. It starts in 2007 because before them there was no testing really in Norway at all. So this is when testing was introduced. We stop at this period for less kind of interesting reasons because of we're just getting the data updated at the moment. So we have the population of year 8 students across the whole country. They're tested in math, English, and Norwegian at the start of year 8. So you should think about these kids as just entering a school, a new school, middle school, and they are now in a different group and they get tested. What we observe is also we can match them back to their grade 5 mix of students and grade 5 scores and characteristics. So this is the their primary school kind of mix. And we also know a pile of things about their, we can match this to register data on children, the family, reasons for entry. So if we know they're immigrant or not, we know this with no measurement error. We know the country of origin, time of entry. And we define, for the purposes, not very sensitive, our results to this, but we define immigrant as child, any child born abroad or with parents born abroad. And as I talked about, we use country origin to define ESB, but it's, you know, it's one thing we don't observe as such in the data. So our first cut is just to use some countries. And I think maybe next slide. So for instance, these are the main ESB countries. There are a pile of others. They're not particularly surprising. And it gives you an idea of the students we have in here. So, you know, Ireland, UK, US, Australia, New Zealand. And many other countries actually, I think listed in the paper, we use this cut of 70%. This comes from a whole pile of different data sources, but I don't want to, I'm willing to take questions on this, but I don't want to focus too much on this because it's robust to using the cuts. I'll talk to you about, in fact, we get better results if we use year 5 scores to identify ESB students. And, you might worry that all I'm going to tell you is be showing you is the effect of that come from UK immigrant students or a particular country, but advantage of the register data, we have enough power to kind of stepwise drop out countries and still get estimates. And it's not that, for instance, us Australians are so good at English that we have massive effects on people. So what I want to show you is how these students differ, even using this cut. So we've got three density estimates here. In the top left, this is the English test score in year 8. This is the math test score in year 8. And this is reading, which is reading in Norwegian. So hopefully this is clear. What I hope you can take away from this is that the key difference in this is this group here, which is how ESB immigrant students do in perform in English relative to everyone else. Refugee children, non-ESB refugees perform a little bit worse than everything, but here ESB immigrants, their main defining feature is they do better in English. And if we look at math, it's not the case, and we'll talk about this a bit more, it's not the case that they're simply positively selected children who from highly educated parents who do well in everything. They do quite similar to native students in math, and in fact they do quite similar to native students in tests of Norwegian. So, there's a lot of measurement error in what we're doing, but at first cut, we're picking up at least a group who are better in English and not just positively selected peers in general. So the empirical approach is quite straightforward. We use within school variation over time. So we have student achievement for individuals in school S at time T. The notation here is it could be a bit cleverer. The achievement is at year 8, so it's just having entered this new school. And basically everything else is lagged at year 5. So to give you an idea of the age groups, which I should be able to do, we're talking about 14-year-olds, 13 or 14-year-olds, and at year 8, and year 5 is about 10. And the year 5 is the first standardized testing of any form that these kids do. So you should be thinking hopefully about selection. We're dealing with some obvious things first. We have school fixed effects here. We have, so we're looking at within school changes in ESB. We've got year fixed effects to do with kind of secular changes over time. But what we're really doing here is we're controlling for the amount of immigrants, the share of immigrants in the school, the share of refugees in the school. It's not really important that we split these out. So these are economic immigrants and refugees. And our identification here is, well, identifying assumption is that whether a given immigrant is ESB or non-ESB, so we're holding these shares constant, is as good as random from the perspective of the native student who's exposed to them, right? So this is an assumption, and we're going to spend a bit of time thinking about mobility in a little while. But any kind of concerns about mobility would be specific responses to ESB instead of non-ESB immigrants. So I said this, it's not clear what a native student is in this setting. So we will use children with 2 Norwegian parents. We could make it children who are born in Norway with 2 Norwegian parents. So this is sometimes something people have said here. So there's a very small group of kids where the parents are both Norwegian and then they've been living in a different country. And I guess it could be England, it could be the US, and then they've come back. It's obviously that's not great for us, but it's kind of numerically unimportant. It's a very uncommon event, but we could pick it up and we can exclude them and it doesn't change the results. As I said, peer measures defined at primary school level. So at year 5, that's when we observed them in the register before when they're tested, and all the controls are at this point. So it's exposure. What we're trying to proxy is exposure in primary school. Keep in mind there's not much mobility, and how that affects later performance in English. So what are the threats to identification? Basically any form of non-random ESB student exposure, right? Even controlling for that. So any form of selective ESB enrollment patterns. So it could be that ESB students are more likely to locate into some schools where native English performance is better, or where there is some improved, keep in mind we have school fixed effects in there, that there's some trending occurring, the area is improving in a way which is also influencing natives English ability. Even if that's not a problem, right? So even if we can buy this assumption that conditional on immigrant shares, whether an immigrant child is ESB or non-ESB, is as good as random. A concern is that we're just picking up positively selected peers and saying something, saying this is something about language when it's really just yet another paper about the fact that high quality peers are good for educational environments. And of course, there's a whole pile of measurement issues related to ESB that I've touched on, but I'll come back to. So let me get, please interrupt because I'm flying through. Give you some results. So a couple of things. It's not obvious, so we're measuring exposure at the school grade level. So I think the perspective often from abroad is that the register data is this kind of omniscient thing where we observe every single, that we know everything about what happens to any given child or any given person in Norway. There are limits on it. One is that the register data or the education data, there's no reason to collect classroom information in it. So what we actually have is exposure at a school level. Now, most schools primary schools in Norway are quite small. So it would be the kind of average grade enrollment might be 30, but it could be up to 50. So you should keep these in mind as, this is why I would say it has almost like an intention to treat type of interpretation, because we don't know actual exposure. We just know variations that are occurring in schools across school grades. The reason why schools are quite small in Norway is because there's a heavy emphasis on being able to walk to school. Basically, kids should be able to walk to school. So typically kids are not, especially under the age of 10, are not expected to travel more than 2 kilometers to school, with some variation in country areas. So what do we do? So it's not clear how we should measure ESB. So we could just put number of ESB students on the right-hand side. Then there's you have to be careful, register data. You can always find stars. There's an effect there, but it's not very large. If we pull this apart and use the fact that we have enough data to do this and just split it up into basically an admitted case of no ESB students, at least one student, I should say, 2 students or 3 or more, then you start to see effects which I would argue are, not huge, but also not negligible after 2 ESB students. So this would fit with a kind of, I wouldn't push this too hard to say that there's a kind of critical mass argument here, but it suggests that you need some sort of level of exposure to see anything. Now, you might think I'm cutting through the data a bit here and cutting it a bit fine, but hopefully as I push through, I'll show you where these effects are concentrated and how these become larger in a way that I think makes sense.
Colin, can I ask a question just about the setting?
Yep.
Thank you. You control for grade enrollment, but within grade enrollment, class sizes could be different. And presumably the the interaction happens within classes.
Yeah, so here's something which I think is important in this setting. So there is one thing which we don't pick up. It's possible that they could all be, if there's 50 kids, they could be taught in 2 classes, or they could be taught in one big one with the same amount of the same amount of teacher overall. So there's a bit of that. We can't pick that up. If there was 50 is too much, actually. If there was 40 kids, now there used to be a school class size rule in Norway, and many papers on this. That no longer exists, but it kind of implicitly used. But the one thing you could not do in Norway is you could not split it into a class of 10 and 30. That would be illegal. That would fall foul of the ability streaming type of argument before. You could also not, you would not be allowed to, so you can think about enforcement here in a second if you want. You can push back on this. But if I had 3 ESB students, all right, across 2 classes, I couldn't explicitly put them all in one class as a principal. That would also be considered illegal in terms of ability streaming at this level.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure, I'm always interested. You can tell me, anyone can tell me they don't buy that, right?
But would they, I mean, so they're not randomly split. Let's say if there are 40 students, they're not randomly split 20-20. They will make sure that ESP are kind of evenly distributed.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, how do people interpret this law is a good question, which I don't have a good answer on. I know what they couldn't do. So, and this isn't just ESB, if they had 3, there are some extremes. If they had 3 kids who were from a refugee background who had real problems, would they be allowed to put them all into one class and give them additional teacher aid in that class? I think by the letter of the law, the answer is no. And I think this is both a strength and a weakness of the Norwegian education system. It's very, very overtly about even treatment, even to the point where that even treatment might be to the detriment of a given child, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I can't rule out you can't rule out that it happens, and I don't have the ability. The whole problem is I don't have the ability to tell you because I don't have the data. But it's shouldn't happen, and it's generally, without pushing too hard, the education authorities and schools tend to operate by the letter of the law here.
Yeah, so my kind of argument was, probably it's not important, but if they split it randomly, so to speak, then you could have 3 students ending up in one class. Yeah. So
yeah. So that's, and I take that point. So the question is, if they split it randomly, then it looked, if ex ante it was random, but ex post looked not random, would they then readjust?
Yeah.
And in some ways, I'm probably the one author on this paper least kind of qualified to comment on this, but that's, I don't know is the answer. That's a good question. Yeah. I should find out. Now,
okay, thanks.
An important thing is, one thing I always worried about is that we're just picking up. So for instance, ESB students who are, so why are people from the US and the UK in Norway? A lot of them are attached to a handful of industries. They're either at universities, working in the oil industry, working in the science industry broadly. So they're a non-random selection of individuals. And the worry you might have is that I'm showing you this here, and I could basically regress this against any outcome and find that they have positive effects, because all I've just done is taken some positively selected immigrants who are generally good at school and found that they have, positive spillover effects. So I think what's important, what's useful for us is to have these other skill measures. So math is probably I don't have a real good prior in Norwegian, to be honest, because you can come up with arguments either way. But math is where you would probably most expect to see that kind of positive peer story. It's kind of a focus of a lot of literature, and there's never an effect. So it looks like it's a domain specific. You may not, still might have doubts, but it seems a domain specific effect, right? So that gives you some just interpretation. I've said all this stuff before. It's about 0.02 of a standard deviation, and ITT interpretation to come back to this. So it's not a zero effect of math and English. It's not a general peer quality effect. I'm going to skip, you know, the natural thing to them do is what we thought is, where would you expect to see these effects? Or on kids who, you know, for example, one thing we don't observe is how much the Norwegian kids are themselves exposed to English outside of the classroom. And a key point of difference would be the education of parents. That's the key point where, you know, because largely that proxies where people work, and a key factor that affects everyday use of English is basically how international the work environment you are in is. So I have some hetero effects. To be honest, there's not much there, and I'm going to skip over, and we'll come back to this in I think more interesting ways. So we did typical stuff. Are there boy-girl differences? Well, you know, they're basically the same point estimate. They get pretty noisy. They're low, high educated differences, you know, where the parents are high, low educated. It looks a little bit like it's more concentrated in people who have kids who have parents who are educated below a certain level. So you might think that for this, you know, one interpretation is that, you know, this is, they have less exposure in general. So exposure to an ESB peer might have a bigger effect on them. It's more of a kind of complementary input for them. But I'm going to come back to, I think there's some more important results later, which I'll come back to. But just
Sorry,
for
Colin,
completeness, yeah.
Could I just pick on one thing here? I mean, one of the aspects could be that the area that, you know, the selection thing that we were talking about before, the area that the ESB move into, and therefore the native children's, now I'm talking about social network outside of the school. So if you have 3+ in the class, then it's likely that there is a bigger ESB group in that neighborhood, and the native children are meeting them outside the school. And that is selected kind of group of friends, maybe, you know, that comes from the selection of, or the quality, whatever, the level of the native household and versus the ESB. And so some of them are more exposed to that network compared to the others.
Yep, perfect.
And
this is, I think, my final nice results that you've got to. So, you know, there's 2 points of that. There's one, the destructive point would be that all I'm proxying is something about the area, right? Which, you know, we do a little bit in the paper on looking at, we have neighborhoods and try and find variation by that, but don't get very where. This is, we're using school level variation here. So it's only, so this is, some of that should be washed out, you know, because of school fixed effects. But the non-destructive thing, which is, you know, so what I'm not going to tell you here is this is happening through the classroom. What I'm going to show you is one or two things later, which suggests is pretty much what you're describing. Now, I can't tell you whether it's happening in the playground or in the neighborhood. So it's exposure to interactions with ESB students, or ESB, that's why I shouldn't use students, ESB kids who happen to be in your grade year. We could try and do some stuff with spillovers across years, I guess, to try and deal with this, or try and proxy for density in the area. I think we tried some of these things, but I've kind of lost track of them. So let me get to that about a little bit later, and then you can tell me whether it's where I've covered it. You know, let's get rid of some typical things you worry about. Could these affect, are these just native mobility with respect to ESB students? Now, keep in mind, there has to be sorting basically only due to English, which seems implausible. But let's do a couple of obvious things. So one is we could just control for the past performance, English performance of native kids, right? So we have that year 5 to try and see whether that changes the story, that we're just picking up differential selection of kids, native kids, according to their, I wouldn't say innate, but earlier English ability into areas with more or less ESB students, and into schools with more or less ESB students. And then one thing we know is, so we know that kids, if we know where a kid lives, we know what school they should go to, primary school, because it's defined, predefined catchment areas. And then that school in that area has a duty to provide a place to that kid. And there's no private school option really. And you can't, you have a right to complain to go to another school, but basically the communer, the council always turns down that that you have a right to complain, but you don't have a right to get a new school, basically, is what happens. So we know what primary school they should go to, and then all these primary schools basically feed into given larger middle schools. So we can then look at whether someone goes into the school that they should go into, predicted to, and we can regress that against the ESB share that they experienced. So the first one just controls for attainment. So we have 5th grade English here, and not surprisingly, that's a decent predictor of your 8th grade English, right? Maybe a bit lower than you often get in value add models. And if anything is cleans up our results a little bit, it changes the estimate size a bit, but it also gives us a bit more precision. So that's not driving the story, selective. It's not that we're picking up some co-movement of good, well, ESB immigrants into school and school years with Norwegian kids who are good at English, right? That should move negatively or towards 0 if that was true. Do you go to your neighborhood school or not? Just run some, this is a linear probability model, it's not important. It's uncorrelated with your exposure to ESB students. So even given if it has to happen inside English, it doesn't look like it's kind of non-random mobility that's driving our results. Now, the other stuff I mentioned is this alternative approaches to measuring ESB. It's not perfect what we're doing. There's a lot of measurement error. Should also keep that in mind. Maybe our estimates are a bit small because of attenuation. So we could do other things. So we have this year 5 test score. We know the what immigrant children got on their test score in English at year 5. And we can then, our alternative approach is basically to say, if you're an immigrant and then you got an English score above some cut, and we change that cut, we will define you as ESB and otherwise not. Do some other things which I won't show. We can drop country of origins. We can use different percentage cuts of ESB. That doesn't change the results. But if we use this kind of data-driven approach, it becomes concentrated only in 3+, so greater than average, greater than a standard deviation above, and greater than 2 standard deviation above. But it, I would say, is supportive of the idea that what we're picking up here is an English language skill effect. I haven't got this here. If I regress these things on maths and Norwegian, there's again a nearly precise 0 effect of being an ESB. So I don't think it's an artifact of how we've chosen to measure whether an immigrant is an ESB immigrant or not.
One question,
yeah.
Colin. In thinking about your sort of value-added model where you controlled for the earlier, yes, go backwards, I'm slow. Is there an argument that you might want to include not just the student's score, but some notion of the peers? I mean, if you think there are peer influences, I'm surprised that you don't try to say, well, look, here's a group of students who are doing better than others, and that may affect what happens in year 8.
It's like, I mean, it's like between you and Matt Lube, it's like you read my paper, because that's the other main thing I'll show you at the end, I think.
Okay, I didn't read it, but
yeah, well, maybe, yeah, sorry, it's like you haven't read my paper. Yeah, that's more like, but thank you, I will get to that, because this is the 2 extensions we do. Let me, before I get to that, I'm mindful I'm running out of time. So let me, there's a million bits of robustness in the paper. We already actually cut out. So there are something I fudged over a little bit is that there are some international schools in Norway, not many, but like a handful. And for instance, one of the ones here in Trondheim, entry is based purely on whether, the first choice is whether you are from an English speaking background. It's not a big school. It has about 30 kids a year, but naturally we've already thrown them out because it's not very informative to look at that school. So they're not numerically important. They're only in maybe 3 or 4 cities. So we also in the paper just exclude, there are some schools and school grades which happen to have high ESB. So we do some cuts. It doesn't change things. The worry is that you're just picking up, for instance, a classic thing here you might worry is the Stavanger effect. So Stavanger is the oil capital, and that's where there's a lot of the fluctuation in ESB students will be happening, because not only is it a place with a lot of, as a proportion, English-speaking background immigrants, it's the place which has a lot of variation, because how many are in there in Stavanger at a point in time is almost directly a function of what's happening on the oil market, right? So we exclude them step by step. We could throw them all out, the big 4 cities. I use a big 4. Trondheim's one of the big 4. It has 200,000 people, so keep that in mind. We're in Norway here. And we can stepwise drop them. It doesn't matter. Before I push on these 2 extensions I've kind of hinted at, do these effects persist? So we can track kids through to year 10, and year 10 test scores are starting to have some stakes attached because they can determine what school you go to. A complication is, and it's a weird thing I think about the Norwegian system, is that kids are randomly assigned. So at year 5 and year 8, basically everyone with some small exclusions has to take these exams. But in year 10, you're randomly assigned an exam and you don't know until 2 weeks beforehand. All right. So a couple of papers use this feature. Former PhD student here and Fanny Landau and co-authors. Very interesting feature because it's completely random. So we lose a lot of numbers. So we need to get some more data soon. So this is English. This is year 10 attainment. This has some stakes attached. You know, I'm pushing things a bit hard, but what I'll tell you is the point estimates are basically the same, even though they're, you know, very imprecise. So there's some suggestion that this effect isn't just some sort of, what I hope this kind of says is that, or it tells us a little bit that there's some sort of skill effect here. It's not just some sort of spike around one test. So mechanisms, what can we do? We're thinking about this. And mostly along the lines that have been mentioned here. And to try and think about whether this happened in the class or not. So, you know, the original thought was this is an added teacher effect, maybe, that, you know, you teaching in a class, English isn't your first language yourself as a teacher, and you have the advantage now of someone who can help you out with kind of some elements. So there's not a perfect test for that, but one thing we thought is that this should be a fairly general effect in class, right? But if instead it was happening through interactions like Matlub was talking about outside of the class, you might think that, you know, we're talking about primary school kids, at least in Norway, a lot of play is very gendered still at this age. So boys play with boys, girls will play with girls a lot. And that an alternative is that if we saw that there was kind of within gender pair effects, boy ESBs affect boys, girls, this suggests that it's happening somewhere else. Right? It's suggestive. And the other point here is that, you know, if you're thinking about generalizing these comments, these thoughts, or trying to think about the processes behind it, how does this vary according to, and what we use is the English ability, the English attainment of Norwegian kids earlier, which is, I think, what John was hinting at. So this is quite, I think, striking. I'm a bit surprised when this came out so clean. So, you know, we've got a lot of data. We're still pushing things hard because we're running things at this kind of school level year, school year level. So what we do is we just put in as a count how many ESBs of the opposite gender there are, right? Just to try and not estimate as so many parameters. So that's up here. So for girls, this is how many boy ESBs there are. For boys, this is how many girl ESBs there are. And you can see that they're 0. And then these are same gender ESBs. And you can see that, you know, the effects are roughly the same size, but imprecise for girls and getting quite large and increasing for boys. So these peer effects, I should say, I can split them up and do this for, you can split this out as well. It doesn't change the results, it just standard errors start to creep a bit more. All these effects are concentrated within gender and predominantly, you know, boys dominate. Is this conclusive? No, but it does suggest that it's outside classroom interaction driving this. And I think this makes it probably, or fits into this story. So if we just take the year 5 scores of Norwegian kids and split them into quartiles, we find that the effect is concentrated entirely in quartile 3. So quartile 1 are kids who, these English tests at year 5 are not very hard, right? These are kids who fail to very basic levels of English, would likely not be able to speak English in any meaningful sense, can do some very basic things. Q2 is probably more likely to be able to speak some basic English and do some basic grammar. Q3 is, not fluent, but with some ability. Why nothing at Q4? So in trying to think about this, I suspect it's topping out effects, because I think there are basically points at which you can't improve. So I can't distinguish between whether it's that or whether there is some sort of non-linearities in these effects. So we're trying to think about how we can look at that. But if we split this into even more categories, push it a bit harder, it's always the case that the top group, there's no effect. So I think that it could just reflect the fact that these test scores, these English test scores, the year 8 tests, they're not designed to kind of distinguish brilliance at the upper end of English. So we just don't see anything there because these kids are hitting against the margin.
Do you see any of your other important controls varying by these quartiles?
Yeah, good question. I don't know off the top of my head, but we could look. I haven't. Yeah, I should look, but I hadn't thought about it, to be honest. What do you have in mind?
In essence, I'm worried that in one of the or more of these quartiles, you're just not getting anything very interesting. And what does that mean, as opposed to it really being ESP?
Well, it's definitely the case, I think, at quartile 1 and 2 that parental education levels have an effect, which as under student characteristics. But what you also is that, so it is useful because if it's the case that this is just a topping out effect, we should see a lack of explanatory power in general in Q4. Thanks, I had not thought of that clearly enough. So even just the explanatory power of the model is kind of interesting there. Yeah, I should look at that. Thanks. Running out of time. I think I've said everything I need to say. So, this is what the paper is about. I hope you believe that we show robust positive effects of ESP exposure on native English attainment. It's not a general peer effect. Some evidence that persists over time. And the kind of point is towards it, where this is concentrated, there's likely to be a kind of social interaction effect that occurs outside of schools. To get a little bit back to Matlu's comment as well, and I think someone else has made this to me before, is it just in the neighborhood, a lot of things changing? We can, to some extent, control for how many ESB people live in neighborhoods. I don't think that's important. I think more critical here is that we can find effects outside of the major cities where there really isn't the case that we don't have neighborhoods that are English, for instance. So I don't think it's coming through there. I think it's coming through interaction of kids who the focal point of contact is the school, and then I can't tell you whether this is, and I'm not sure if it's important, whether this is playground interaction or neighborhood interaction afterwards. And that's it.
Great.
Thank you.
Very good timing. Thanks, Colin. Questions? Any more questions? Well, people are thinking this is, can I just ask another thing? This is probably not important, and as you mentioned, you don't want to really talk that much about it, but what is exactly country of origin? I mean, how is that? Is it country of birth? Or, I mean, after living 20 years in the UK, if I move to Norway, I'm coming from the UK or I'm coming from Pakistan?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. No, I don't want to talk about it because it's a hard question, but it's a good one. Yeah.
So you don't have country of birth?
But I can't remember what we do. I think we're using country of birth.
Okay, so then it's not a problem.
Well, yes and no.
I guess. I mean, it's
it's a source of measurement, because then if you come to Norway with kids, then I'm going to say you're not English speaking background unless I use I mean, that's one reason why using the data-based approach is useful, because it'll pick up them. that your kids
Yeah,
truly
but
are English
technically
speaking.
you are. I mean, in your model, I am not ESB.
Yeah,
Yeah. So then it's not a, in that sense, at least in that way, it's not a measurement problem, because if you're picking up the country of origin, country of birth, I mean, I suppose.
yeah, but sitting here talking to you right now, Matlub, I would say you should be ESB.
Yeah, but that was the question I asked. That was the question I asked you earlier as well. If ESB's only first language is English.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's where, I mean, you're probably maybe losing some of them. I mean, it may not be a big number, but you might be losing a few.
Yeah. No, it's a question of interpretation as well. So I'm being a bit loose there as well. You're right to pick me up on it, because one of the issues with using country of origin is, of course, if you're from, let's pick a random country, Ghana, and you come to Norway as a skilled laborer, I would say you're probably got quite good English language skills, because you're not going to have Norwegian language skills.
Yeah.
And that otherwise you would not have got the job. So that's kind of why I don't like using. I'm not convinced that it's assigning based on country is the best, but I'm kind of heartened by the fact that using a mixture of immigrant and immigration status and prior test scores gives us similar results.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions?
One more back on the earlier theme. Then I'll let you go, Colin. Is there an argument that you might want to control in some of these estimates for the Norwegian peer effects? In other words, how good are the English skills of your Norwegian peers?
Yeah, good point. And I think we thought about this. I've got a feeling we did it, but you're right. It's because in the back of my mind, I'm thinking I have a kind of education production function in my mind, and I'm thinking about this input coming in, peers as an input, and obviously there are substitution and complementarities with existing inputs, and that's an important. Yeah. No, we should think about that. Thanks.
Teresa? You have a
Yes, I
question?
have just a curiosity, because I'm thinking that maybe, if you have a older brother or sister that is studying a few years in advance, you could be affected. You could have some exposure to English. I don't know whether you can control for having older brother and sister, because for sure they are studying English at school, and you catch up some word, or at least so you get familiar with this language.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, our original idea was, because our previous paper, which I mentioned, which look at refugees, we use sibling fixed effects, and we try and look at it. We just haven't had enough variation in data to do it. But we have parity in here, which is not really the same. In theory, if we could observe for even English language skills of the older siblings and things like this. So in theory, yes, we could explore these things, and you're right, there's kind of likely to be within household spillover effects. I think we're up against it a little bit with the data, but we're about to expand it out another 5 or 6 years. And then you're right, I think we should return to these things, because we observe the family, we observe everyone's test scores, etc. The peers are exposed to.
Anyone else? Well, it's just about time anyway, so that's great. Perfect timing. Thank you so much, Colin. That was really very interesting paper, and of course, very nice presentation. So thanks for doing this. And well, we will meet again next month, whoever can make it. Until then, goodbye.
Thank you, Rod. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Colin.